Before the snow began to fall on the marble steps of the estate, before the iron gate sighed shut behind him at 4:17 in the morning, before the dogs in the kennel lifted their heads and went still in a way they never did for him, Castor Velicour walked into his own house and found a silence that did not belong to it. The kind of silence a man only hears once in his life. The kind that arrives in the shape of something missing. He stopped in the foyer with the cold still on his coat and listened for the sound of his 3-week-old son. There was none. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his shoes leaving wet prints on the runner, and pushed open the nursery door. The bassinet was empty. The blanket was folded. On the pillow of the bed where his wife should have been sleeping, there was a single white envelope, and beneath it, an ultrasound photo she had once pressed against his chest in a hospital corridor and made him promise, "Whatever happens, you protect this." 12 miles south, in the back of a coach bus rolling through the dark, a woman held her newborn against her sternum and whispered the only prayer she still remembered. Even men like Castor were not built for this kind of quiet. The estate stood on the western ridge of Halverton Pines, 14 acres of black pine and frozen grass enclosed by a wall that had been built before any of the current neighbors were born. From the road, it looked like a place that did not want to be seen. The hedges had been trimmed too sharply. The windows were always half-shuttered. The driveway curved in such a way that no one approaching the front door could see who was coming until it was already too late to leave. Inside, the house had the particular hush of wealth that had been earned in rooms where the lights were never turned on. Marble floors, long corridors, a staircase wide enough for 2 people to walk shoulder to shoulder, though no one ever did. The chandeliers had been imported from a hotel in Vienna that had closed after the war. The paintings on the walls were originals, but no one in the house had chosen them. They had simply arrived, the way everything in Castor Velicour's life arrived. Quietly, without question, already paid for. The nursery was on the second floor at the end of a hallway that smelled faintly of cedar and the powdered formula tin left open on the changing table. The walls were a soft, careful gray. A mobile of small wooden birds turned slowly above the bassinet, set in motion by a vent that had not yet shut off. The birds turned. The room did not breathe. And in the corner, beneath the window, a rocking chair sat empty, still moving very faintly, as if it had only just been left. Her name was Marisol Quentin, and she was 26 years old, and she had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the night her son had been born. The bus had left the station at 3:42 in the morning. She had bought the ticket with cash, paid the extra fee to skip the manifest, and given the clerk a name that was not hers. The clerk had not asked questions. The clerk had simply looked at her, at the pale exhaustion in her face, at the newborn pressed against her coat, and slid the ticket across the counter and said, "Gate 4, ma'am. Safe travels." And Marisol had nearly cried at the word safe because she had not heard it directed at her in so long that it sounded like a foreign language she had forgotten how to speak. She sat in the second-to-last row by the window with her son cradled inside her coat. He was 3 weeks and 2 days old. His name was Auden. She had chosen it in the hospital, alone, while Castor was somewhere in another part of the city, doing whatever he did on the nights he disappeared. The nurses had asked her what to write on the birth certificate, and she had said Auden Quentin, not Velicour, and she had watched the nurse's pen hesitate above the paper and then move on without comment. That had been the first decision, the first quiet rebellion. The first thread of the rope she had been weaving in secret since the day she came home from the hospital. She had been a different person once. She had studied veterinary medicine at a state college 3 states away. She had played the cello in a quartet that practiced on Sunday afternoons in a church basement. She had laughed loudly. She had argued with her sisters. She had owned a small dog named Pepper who slept across her feet at night and snored like a man twice his size. All of those things had been taken from her not at once, but slowly, over 4 years, the way a river takes stones from a bank, one grain at a time, until the shape of the shore is something it never used to be. Castor had not raised his hand to her. Not once. That was the part she could not explain to people, because people thought abuse was a fist. But Castor had taken her phone the day they got engaged and replaced it with one he chose. He had hired her a driver who reported every stop. He had moved her sister's phone numbers into a folder she did not have the password for. He had told her, in the gentle voice he used for everything, that the world was a dangerous place for a woman married to a man like him, and that her safety required certain reasonable inconveniences. She had believed him. Or she had told herself she believed him, which is a different and more terrible thing. The cello was in storage somewhere. She did not know where. She had not played in 3 years. And then, 11 days ago, she had found a phone in the pocket of his coat. Not his phone. A second one. A small flip phone. The kind that does not appear on any account. She had opened it because Auden had been crying, and Castor had been in the shower, and she had been looking for the car keys. And on the screen, there had been a photograph. A woman. A hotel room. A timestamp from the night Marisol had been in labor. She had not screamed. She had not cried. She had stood in the hallway holding the phone, and she had understood, with a clarity she had not felt in 4 years, that she was going to leave, and that she was going to do it without telling a single person, because there was no one in her life Castor had not already touched. She had begun packing the next morning, a diaper bag with a broken zipper she had repaired with thread, a sleeve of cash she had saved by overpaying the housekeeper and asking for the change back, her grandmother's garnet ring, still in its velvet box, a folded copy of Auden's birth certificate, a burner phone she had bought from a gas station and hidden inside the lining of a stuffed elephant. On the bus, she pressed her cheek against the cold window and watched the world fall away from her in long black streaks of frozen field and empty highway. Auden made a small sound against her chest, and she shifted him, and she counted his fingers the way she did every time he stirred, because she could not yet trust that he was real. 5, 5, 10, 10. The most ordinary miracle she had ever held. The driver announced the next stop in a voice flattened by too many years of saying the same words. Brindlemark. 12 minutes. Marisol did not know where Brindlemark was. She had picked the city by closing her eyes and putting her finger on a folded paper map. It had been the only honest decision she had made in 4 years. She held her son tighter. The bus rolled on. The bus pulled into Brindlemark at 6:51 in the morning, and the sky had not yet decided what color it wanted to be. Marisol stepped down onto the wet pavement of the station with Auden tucked against her sternum and the diaper bag pulling hard on her right shoulder. And she stood for a moment beneath the yellow sodium light of the platform and let the cold air find every place on her body where she had been holding her breath. The station was almost empty. A man in a stained orange vest pushed a wide broom across the tile in slow, indifferent arcs. A vending machine hummed against the far wall. A woman in a uniform was wiping down the counter of a closed coffee kiosk, and she looked up at Marisol once and looked away again. The way people in places like this had learned to look at women carrying babies through bus stations in the dark. Marisol counted the money in her coat pocket. $312. She had counted it 11 times since boarding the bus, and the number had not changed. But she counted it again because counting was the only thing her hands knew how to do that did not shake. She found a bench at the far end of the station and sat down, and she pulled the side of her coat away from her chest, and she looked at her son. Auden was awake. His eyes were the color of slate after rain, the way newborns' eyes are before they decide what they will be, and he was looking at her with the unfocused gravity of a creature who has not yet learned that the world is not entirely made of his mother's face. She had nursed him on the bus, in the dark, with a thin muslin cloth draped over her shoulder, and she had cried silently while she did it, because the woman across the aisle had been pretending not to watch, and Marisol had been so tired she could no longer tell whether the tears were grief or relief, or simply the involuntary leaking of a body that had not been allowed to feel anything for 4 years. His diaper was wet. She knew before she touched it. She had 3 clean ones left in the bag and no wipes, because she had used the last of them on the bus, and she sat there for a full minute staring at her son and trying to do the arithmetic of the next 24 hours in her head. 3 diapers, half a bottle of formula, in case her milk failed her again the way it had on the second day. A change of clothes for him. Nothing for her. The cash, the ring, the certificate, the burner phone with no one to call. She thought very quietly, I am not going to be enough. And then Auden made a small sound. Not a cry, not quite, but the soft animal complaint of a baby who had learned in 3 short weeks that his mother was the answer to every question. And Marisol bent her head and pressed her lips against the warm crown of his skull, and she breathed in the smell of him, the milk and the wool and the something underneath that did not have a name, and she said, against his hair, in a voice no one else could hear, I will be enough. I have to be. I will be. 20 feet away, a man in a long charcoal coat sat down on the bench across from her and did not look at her once. The man's name was Thessaly Brock, and he was 64 years old, and he had not been afraid of another human being in 37 years. He had come to the station the way he came every Tuesday, to buy a newspaper from the kiosk at the east entrance, where the woman who ran it had cataracts and bad knees, and where Thessaly had taken to bringing her a cup of coffee from the diner 2 doors down. He was a man who had built a life out of small kindnesses performed at the edges of his day, and a man whom the rest of his life did not match in any obvious way. He had been, until 11 years ago, a federal prosecutor. He had spent 22 years putting men in prison for crimes that most people could not bring themselves to read about in a newspaper without folding the page over. He had a face that had been described, in print, as unyielding, a word he privately thought was generous, because the truer word was closed. He was not a man who looked at strangers in bus stations. He had spent his career learning that most strangers wanted nothing from you, and the ones who did were usually the ones who looked the most ordinary, and that the safest posture for a man of his particular history was a courteous and unwavering disinterest in the lives of the people around him. But he had glanced at Marisol once when she came down the platform steps. And then he had glanced again. And then he had sat down on the bench across from her and pretended very deliberately to read a newspaper he had already finished, because Thessaly Brock had recognized something. Not her face. He had never seen her face. He had recognized the posture, the way she had come off the bus with her shoulders curled forward around the baby. Not from cold, but from the lifelong habit of making her body smaller in rooms where her body was not safe. The way she had sat down with her back to the wall and her bag between her ankles and her eyes scanning the exits before she scanned anything else. The way her hand had moved, twice to the inside pocket of her coat, checking that something was still there. Cash, probably. Or a phone. Or a key to a place she had not yet decided whether she could reach. He had seen that posture before. He had seen it on witness stands. He had seen it in the hallway outside his own office when women had come in to give statements and had then refused to sign them. He had seen it in his own mother every Sunday for 18 years. His mother's name had been Imogen. She had played the piano in a small Methodist church in a town in eastern Ohio, and she had been the only adult in Thessaly's childhood who had told him, in plain words, that the world was a beautiful place worth surviving. She had said it on the porch, in the summers, while the cicadas screamed, and she had said it in the kitchen, on the mornings when his father had come home from wherever he went, and the dishes had been broken and the floor had been swept by someone, never his father. before Thessaly had come downstairs. His father had not hit Thessaly. He had hit Imogen. And he had done it in the quiet, methodical way of a man who believed himself to be reasonable, who believed that a household required correction, who had never once raised his voice in front of a neighbor, and who had been buried when he finally died by 3 pallbearers who described him in the church newsletter as a gentleman of the old school. Imogen had outlived him by 2 years. She had died on a Wednesday afternoon in a hospital bed Thessaly had paid for, holding his hand, her body finally permitted to stop performing the long, slow labor of pretending to be unharmed. She had said, near the end, that she was sorry. For what? He had asked. And she had not answered. She had only closed her eyes and turned her face toward the window. He had spent the next 22 years putting men like his father in prison. It had not brought her back. It had only made him a man who knew, with the precision of a bone setter, the shape of what abuse did to a woman's body when she carried it for long enough, and the shape of what it did to her posture when she finally set it down. He looked at Marisol Quentin across the bus station, and he did not see a stranger. He saw the angle of his mother's shoulders on a Sunday morning in 1968. Walking into church with a high collar buttoned all the way to her jaw. He folded his newspaper. He set it down on the bench. He did not approach her. He had learned, over the long years of his career, that the worst thing you could do to a woman in her first hours of running was to make her feel hunted by the next man who saw her. He took out his phone. He sent one text, to a number he had not dialed in 4 years, belonging to a woman named Devereaux Ainsworth, who ran the only domestic violence intake service in 3 counties that had ever called him back the same day. I think I'm looking at one. Bus station. Brindlemark. Newborn. She doesn't know I see her yet. Tell me what you want me to do. Then he put the phone away. And he waited. Devereaux's reply came in 90 seconds. Don't approach her yet. Watch the exits. If a man comes for her, call me back. I'm 40 minutes out. Thessaly read the message twice, and then he did something he had not done in a very long time. He disobeyed. Not because he doubted Devereaux. He had never once, in his life, doubted Devereaux Ainsworth about anything. He disobeyed because Marisol had just stood up. She had stood up the way a woman stands up when she has just realized she does not know where she is going. She had taken 3 steps toward the station's east doors, and then she had stopped, and she had turned, and she had looked back at the bench where she had been sitting as if she had forgotten something there. And Thessaly had seen, in the small frozen second of that turn, the exact moment a person ran out of plan. He had seen it on witness stands. He had seen it on his mother's face, more times than he could count. It was the look of someone who had used every ounce of will she possessed to get herself to a particular bench in a particular building, and who had now arrived, and who had nothing left to spend. He stood up slowly. He kept his hands visible. He walked, not toward her, but past her, in a long, deliberate arc that brought him to a vending machine 6 feet from where she stood. He fed $2 into the machine. He pressed a button at random. A bottle of water dropped into the tray. He bent down and retrieved it. And then he straightened, and he held the bottle out at arm's length without stepping any closer. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low, even. The voice of a man who had spent his whole career learning that volume was the language of people who needed to be feared. "I'm not going to ask you anything. I'm not going to follow you. I just bought this, and I don't drink cold water. If you want it, it's yours." Marisol stared at him. She had become, in the last 4 years, a very efficient reader of men. She read his coat first. Wool, expensive, but old. The kind of coat a man kept because it had outlasted his wife. She read his shoes, clean, unfashionable. The shoes of a man who walked in them for hours. She read his hands, large, steady, no rings. And she read his face. And it was the face that confused her, because there was no hunger in it, no appraisal, no calculation. There was only a kind of tired, watchful kindness, the way a doctor looks at a patient he has already decided to help and is now waiting for permission to begin. She did not take the water. "I'm fine," she said. The lie left her mouth so cleanly she almost believed it herself. Thessaly nodded, as if she had said something perfectly reasonable. He set the bottle down on the bench beside her, not in her hand, and he stepped back, 2 full paces. "There's a diner across the street," he said. "It's called Halverson's. It's warm, and the woman who runs it is a friend of mine, and there is a back booth where no one can see you from the door. I am going to walk over there now, and I am going to order a coffee, and I am going to sit in that booth alone for as long as it takes me to drink it. If you and your son come in while I'm there, I will buy you breakfast, and I will not ask you a single question you don't want to answer. If you don't come in, I will finish my coffee, and I will leave, and you will never see me again." He paused. "I'm telling you what I'm going to do," he said, "so that nothing I do is a surprise. Surprises are for people who haven't already had enough of them." He turned. He walked toward the east doors. He did not look back. Marisol stood very still in the middle of the station, holding her sleeping son, with a bottle of cold water on the bench beside her and a man's footsteps fading toward a door. And for the first time in 4 years, she heard a sentence spoken to her by a man that did not contain a single instruction. Halverson's diner sat on the corner of Brindlemark Avenue and Tully Street, a low brick building with a green awning faded by 20 winters into something the color of pond water. The bell above the door was an actual bell, brass, and it rang twice when you walked in, once on the open, once on the close, the way bells do in places that have not been remodeled since the people who built them died. Thessaly took the back booth. He ordered black coffee from the woman behind the counter, a woman in her 50s named Halverson who did not need to ask what he wanted. He waited. Marisol came through the door 11 minutes later. She came in slowly, with Auden cradled against her shoulder and the diaper bag still pulling on her arm, and she stopped just inside the entrance and let the warmth of the room hit her face. The bell rang twice behind her. Halverson looked up, saw her, saw the baby, and did not say anything at all. She simply lifted her chin toward the back booth in a small, unmistakable gesture that meant, "Go. He's waiting. No one will look at you." Marisol walked the length of the diner with her eyes on the floor. She slid into the booth across from Thessaly and set the bag down beside her and adjusted Auden against her chest and did not lift her face. Halverson came over without being called. She set down a coffee for Marisol and a glass of water that had no ice in it, the way you brought water to a nursing mother. She set down a small plate of toast that no one had ordered. She said, "Take your time, sugar," in a voice that contained no questions, and she left. Marisol stared at the toast. "You can eat it," Thessaly said. "Or not. There's no obligation attached to a piece of bread." She reached for it. Her hand was shaking. She steadied it against the edge of the plate and ate it in small, careful bites. Thessaly drank his coffee. He looked at the window. He did not watch her eat, because watching a person eat when they are that hungry is a violation, and he knew it. When she had finished the toast, she said, "Why are you doing this?" Thessaly set his cup down. "That's the right question," he said, "and you deserve an honest answer. But before I give it to you, I want to tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to ask your name. I'm not going to ask his name. I'm not going to ask where you came from or where you're going. Do you understand?" She nodded once. "Good," he said. "The honest answer is that my mother spent 36 years married to a man who hurt her in a quiet, ordinary, respectable way, and she died before anyone helped her. And I have spent most of my adult life trying to make that fact mean something. When I saw you come down off that bus, I recognized the way you were holding yourself. There is a woman named Devereaux Ainsworth who runs an organization in this county whose entire purpose is to help women in your situation, and I have already texted her, and she is on her way. You can leave before she arrives. You can stay and meet her. You can stay and refuse her help. Any of those is acceptable. Marisol looked at him for a long time. You haven't asked anything I'd lie about, she said at last. No. Why? Because the most useful thing I can do for you in the first hour is not to require you to perform your own competence. You have spent a long time, I think, being asked to prove that you deserve help. The fact that you are sitting in this booth at 6:58 in the morning with a 3-week-old child and a bag with a broken zipper is the only proof I require. She put her hands over her face. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury her body had not yet remembered how to afford. She just held her hands there, against the bones of her face, for a long moment, while Auden slept on her chest and the diner hummed quietly around them. When she lowered her hands, she said, His name is Auden. My name is Marisol. Thessaly Brock. She said very quietly, I left him this morning. I planned it for 11 days. He'll have found out about 3 hours ago. He is not the kind of man who lets things go. Thessaly did not change his expression. What is he? He's the kind of man, Marisol said, that other men in this country drive long distances to avoid. There was a small silence. Tell me his name. Castor Velicour. Thessaly's face did not move, but something behind his eyes, very far back, did. The way a drawer closes in another room, the way a man recognizes a name he had hoped never to hear in connection with someone he was now in a position to protect. All right, he said. All right. We are going to need a different plan than the one I was about to suggest. He pulled out his phone. He sent a second text to Devereaux Ainsworth. It said only one word. Velicour. 14 miles north, at the estate on Halverton Pines, Castor Velicour was sitting on the floor of his son's nursery with the white envelope unopened in his hand. The letter was 3 pages long. He could feel the weight of it through the paper. 3 pages was not the length of a goodbye. 3 pages was the length of an indictment. He set it down. He picked up the ultrasound photo instead. And in the small, grainy gray shape of the child he had not yet held enough times to remember the weight of, he saw, for the first time in his entire adult life, a face he could not buy his way back to. He stood up. He walked downstairs. He told his head of security, a man named Pell, that no one was to look for her. No phone calls, no drivers, no favors called in. Pell began to protest. Castor cut him off with 3 words. I said no one. Then he went into his office, closed the door, and did something he had not done in 29 years. He wept. Devereaux Ainsworth arrived at Halverson's at 7:26 in the morning. She came in through the back, the way she always came into places when she was meeting a woman for the first time, because front doors were where men watched. She was 51 years old, black, 6 feet tall in flat shoes, and built like someone who had spent her 20s carrying other people's children out of houses. She wore a navy coat that had seen weather. She had a leather folder under one arm and a thermos of tea in her hand, and a face that, when it looked at Marisol, did the one thing Marisol had not been prepared for. It softened. Not in pity. Devereaux Ainsworth did not pity women. Pity was a posture for people who had not done the work. Her face softened the way a face softens when it sees a person it has been waiting for, even when it has never met that person before. She slid into the booth beside Thessaly. She set the folder down. She said, Marisol, my name is Devereaux. I'm going to talk for about 90 seconds, and then I'm going to stop, and you're going to tell me what you need. Is that all right? Yes. Good. I run an organization called Hollowmere House. We have been operating in this county for 19 years, and we have moved over 400 women and 600 children out of dangerous homes, and we have not lost one. Not one, Marisol. Not in 19 years. We have built a network the men we are hiding women from cannot see and cannot break. Lawyers, doctors, judges, 2 retired federal investigators, a forensic accountant. What I am offering is not a shelter. It is a wall. Marisol nodded. Her throat had closed. I also need to tell you, Devereaux said, more quietly now, that Thessaly told me your husband's name, and this changes nothing about my offer. We have moved women out from under men like him before. The procedure will be more careful. The paperwork will be slower. You and Auden will not stay in Brindlemark. But we will move you, and you will be safe, and your son will grow up in a house with a door that locks from the inside, and a mother who does not flinch when the phone rings. I need to know if you want it. Marisol opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I have $312, she said. I don't have a lawyer. I don't have family that he hasn't already gotten to. I have a birth certificate with my last name on it, not his. I have a garnet ring my grandmother gave me. I have Auden. I don't have anything else. You have Auden, Devereaux said. And you got him out. Marisol, you got him out. Do you understand what that means? No. It means you did the hardest thing a woman in your situation ever does, and you did it alone, and you did it with a 3-week-old child, and you did it without telling a single person. There are women who plan to leave for 10 years and never go. You went. The fact that you are sitting in this booth right now means you have already done the part that I cannot do for you. Everything from here is just logistics. Marisol began to cry. Not the tight, controlled tears she had been carrying for 11 days. Real tears. The kind that come out of a body that has been holding itself rigid for so long that the simple act of being permitted to leak feels for a moment like something is breaking. Auden stirred against her chest. She bent her face to his hair and let the tears fall into the soft fuzz of his head and did not try to wipe them. Thessaly looked at his coffee cup. Devereaux did not touch her. When Marisol could speak again, she said, Yes, I want it. I want the wall. Good, Devereaux said. Then here is what is going to happen. She opened the folder. There was a car waiting in the alley behind the diner, a gray sedan with paper plates, driven by a woman named Junie, Halverson's niece, who had grown up working in this diner and who, 11 years ago, when she was 22, had come home one Sunday with a black eye and a story. And Halverson had called Devereaux, and Junie had been working for Hollowmere ever since. Marisol and Auden would be driven to a safe house in a county Devereaux did not name aloud. Marisol would stay there for a minimum of 9 days, while Devereaux's team did 3 things: file an emergency protective order in a jurisdiction Castor's lawyers did not have a foothold in, secure full physical and legal custody of Auden under Marisol's surname, using the birth certificate she had been clear-eyed enough to file in the hospital, and begin the careful, slow work of severing Marisol financially from Castor without alerting him to where she had gone. Men like him usually hire people, Devereaux said, private investigators, sometimes worse. The only thing that defeats a man with that much money is a woman who has moved through a network he cannot purchase. We are that network. You are now inside it. What do I owe you? Marisol said. Nothing. Not now. Not later. Not ever. We are funded by women who have already come through, and by people like Thessaly here, and by a small number of donors who give quietly because they had a sister or a mother or a daughter once. The bill, Marisol, has already been paid. Long before you walked into this diner. Do not insult the women who paid it by trying to add to it. Marisol nodded. She looked at Thessaly. Why are you really doing this? She said. The whole truth. This time. Thessaly was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Because when my mother was 41 years old, she walked out of our house at 3 a.m. with me on her hip and a suitcase in her hand. She made it to the end of our street. And then she turned around and she went back. She told me, years later, that she went back because there was no one waiting for her at the end of the block. No bench, no bus, no diner, no woman with a folder. Just a long road, and a child, and the dark. She lived another 28 years inside that house, and every one of them was a year she would not have had to live if someone had been at the end of her block. He looked at Marisol. "I'm just trying," he said quietly, "to be at the end of someone's block." The booth was very still. When they stood to leave, Halverson came around the counter with a long wool coat in her hands, a heavy gray one. "It was my husband's," she said. "He's been gone 12 years. You take it, sugar. The wind out there is going to find every place that bag doesn't cover." Marisol did not have words. She let Halverson drape the coat over her shoulders in the small parking lot behind the diner, and she carried Auden inside it, and she walked to the gray sedan with Junie waiting at the open back door. Devereaux closed the folder. "Let's go," she said. The safe house was on the second floor of a 3-story building above a dry cleaner in a town Marisol could not later remember the name of. The stairs were narrow, the hallway smelled of soap and cardboard. Junie unlocked the door and then stepped back and let Marisol enter first, because Junie had been trained over 11 years to let the woman cross the threshold under her own power. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen the size of a closet, a living room with a couch and a single lamp. The crib was already set up by the window. There were 3 swaddles folded on the changing table, and a tin of formula, and a stack of newborn diapers, and a box of nursing pads, and a soft gray blanket that someone had washed before Marisol arrived. Someone she would never meet. Marisol stood in the middle of the room. She turned, slowly, in a circle. She walked to the door. She slid the chain. She turned the deadbolt. She turned the second deadbolt. She rested her forehead against the wood and stood there for a long time, with her son still strapped to her chest, breathing. Then she walked to the crib. She unwrapped Auden from her coat. She laid him down on the mattress for the first time in 11 days that he had been allowed to sleep on a surface that was not her own body. She watched him stretch in his sleep, the small, involuntary spread of newborn fingers reaching for a chest that was no longer there. And then she watched him settle, with his cheek against the cotton sheet, breathing evenly, safe. She sat down on the floor beside the crib. She did not cry. She had cried in the diner, and there was nothing left for now. She just sat there, with her hand on the rail, and watched her son sleep, and listened, for the first time in 11 days, to a silence that contained no danger. After a long time, she slept too, sitting up, with her hand still on the rail. But that night, on the floor of a stranger's apartment, beside a crib she had not bought, in a town whose name she did not know, Marisol Quentin heard her 3-week-old son breathe through an entire night for the first time, without being afraid that the next breath might be the one that brought a man through the door. And in the morning, when Junie knocked twice and entered with coffee, Marisol opened her eyes, and she saw the gray light of the kitchen window, and she saw Auden's small fist against the sheet, and she said, in a voice she did not recognize as her own, "We made it." She had not known until she said it that it was true. The work, as Devereaux had promised, was logistics. The emergency protective order was filed in a courthouse 200 miles from Brindlemark, in front of a judge named Honora Calderwood, who had been on the bench for 26 years and had a private rule about the cases Devereaux Ainsworth brought her. She read them first, before her morning docket, with the door closed and the phone off. She read Marisol's file in 19 minutes. She granted the order on the spot. She granted, additionally, an emergency custody petition awarding sole physical and legal custody of Auden Quentin to his mother, citing the birth certificate Marisol had filed under her own surname, and citing the documented pattern of coercive control that Devereaux's team had assembled in 72 hours from medical records, banking records, the housekeeper's quiet testimony, and a statement from a nurse at the hospital who remembered Marisol giving birth alone. Castor Velacour was served at his estate on a Thursday morning at 9:14 by a process server hired through 3 intermediaries who left the property within 90 seconds of putting the documents in his hand. He read them standing in his foyer. He read them twice. He did not call his lawyers. This, more than anything, was the thing his lawyers later said they had not understood. A man who could have crushed her with a phone call did not pick up the phone. He sat down on the bottom step of his own staircase. He set the papers on the marble beside him. He put his face in his hands, and he stayed there, in the foyer of the house his wife had walked out of, for an hour and 40 minutes, while the snow fell against the tall windows, and the dogs in the kennel did not bark, and the silence she had left behind continued to do what silence does in houses like that, which is to grow. When he stood up, he walked into his office and he wrote 2 checks. The first was for $1 million made out to Hollowmere House, in the name of a foundation his accountant set up that afternoon, with a board of 3 women he would never meet. The second was for an amount his accountant refused to read aloud, deposited into a trust in Auden's name, with provisions that prevented Castor or any entity associated with him from accessing it, ever, under any circumstance, and with a single name trustee, Honora Calderwood, who would, 3 months later, accept the role with a 1-line letter that said only understood. Then Castor walked into the small chapel on the east side of his property, a chapel his grandmother had built in 1962, and which had not been entered by anyone in the family for 19 years. And he sat down in the second pew, and he did something his men would not have believed if they had seen it. He prayed. Not for forgiveness. He was not a man who believed forgiveness was something one asked for. He prayed instead the way men of his generation pray when they have nothing left. Silently, with his elbows on his knees and his forehead against his interlaced hands. He prayed that his son would never look like him in the mirror. He prayed that his wife would someday be told by someone other than him that she had been right to go. He prayed that the protective order would hold. And then, because Castor Velacour was still, beneath every other thing, a man who knew the difference between an apology that cost nothing and an apology that cost everything, he made one more decision. He dissolved his organization, not all at once, not publicly. Over the next 11 months, in a series of quiet, careful steps that his lieutenants would later describe to federal investigators with a degree of cooperation that surprised everyone, Castor Velacour unwound 20 years of operations. He liquidated the holdings that could not be made clean. He turned over, through an attorney, a sealed list of names to the office of a U.S. attorney he had once tried, unsuccessfully, to bribe. He paid out severances to the men who had served him, and he told them, individually, in a voice none of them had ever heard him use, that whatever they did next was their own to choose, but that he would not be calling them again. By the following autumn, the estate at Halverton Pines had been sold to a private trust. Castor moved into a 2-bedroom house on the coast of Maine, under his mother's maiden name, where he took a job at a marine supply store and answered the phone in a voice that had been described, by a customer who did not know who he was, as unnervingly polite. He did not try to contact Marisol. Not once. Not on Auden's first birthday. Not on his second. Not on the morning of his third, when Castor sat alone at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a small wrapped box he had bought the week before, a wooden train, hand-painted the kind a child could hold, and looked at it for a long time before he stood up and walked it down to the post office and mailed it, without a return address, to Devereux Ainsworth at Hollowmere House, with a note that said only, "If she will allow it. If she will not, please donate it. I will not ask again." Devereux read the note twice. She walked the package across the office to a young woman who had recently joined the staff as a part-time intake counselor. A young woman whose dark hair was beginning to grow back into the shape it had been before 4 years of being told how to wear it, and handed it to her, and said, "This came for you. You can do whatever you want with it. There is no wrong answer." Marisol opened the box. She looked at the train. She looked at her son, sitting on the carpet with a stack of foam blocks, 3 years and 4 months old, with his mother's eyes and a name that did not belong to anyone but him. She set the train down on the carpet beside Auden. He picked it up. He pushed it across the floor. He laughed. Marisol watched him for a long time. Then she folded the note in half, and she folded it again, and she put it in her pocket. She did not write back, but she did not throw it away. 5 years later, on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, the bell above the door of Halverson's diner rang twice. Halverson herself was no longer behind the counter. She had retired the previous spring, and the diner had passed to her niece Junie. The same Junie who, on a cold morning long ago, had driven a gray sedan with paper plates out of the alley behind this building, with a young mother and a sleeping newborn in the back seat. Junie had kept the green awning. She had kept the brass bell. She had kept the back booth exactly as it had been. The bell rang twice. Junie looked up. A woman walked in with a small boy. The woman was 31 years old now. She wore a knee-length wool coat the color of moss and a cello case slung over her right shoulder, because she had begun playing again. Slowly, at first only in her apartment, and then, after a long time, in a small chamber group that practiced on Sunday afternoons in the basement of a Methodist church. The boy walking beside her was 3 weeks short of his 5th birthday. His hair was the color of wet sand. He was holding her left hand. In his right hand, he was holding, carefully, with the seriousness of a small child carrying something he had been told was important. A wooden train, hand-painted, slightly chipped along one edge from being loved for 2 years. "Mom," he said, "can I sit by the window?" "You can sit anywhere you want, Auden. The booth in the back. The booth in the back is fine." Junie watched them walk the length of the diner. Marisol Quentin had been, from the first morning Junie had ever seen her, a woman who needed to walk through doors on her own. They sat down in the back booth. Marisol set her cello case against the wall. Auden climbed onto the bench across from her and set the wooden train on the table, in the precise center, the way he had set it on every table in his life. Junie came over with a coffee and a glass of milk. She did not write down their order. She knew it. "Pancakes for the gentleman," she said. "Egg sandwich on rye for his mother. Strawberries cut in half, not in quarters." "Yes, please." Junie nodded. She did not linger. Marisol looked across the table at her son. He was working on the wooden train, pushing it across the table in a slow, careful arc. He made a small sound that meant station, stopped the train, and looked up at his mother. "Mom." "Yes, baby." "Is this a special day?" She was quiet for a moment. "Why do you ask?" "Because we don't usually come here on Tuesdays?" She smiled. The smile started at the corner of her mouth, and it took its time, and by the time it reached her eyes it had become something she could not have named in words. "Yes," she said. "It's a special day. 5 years ago, you and I came to this diner for the first time. You were very small, you were sleeping. A man bought me a piece of toast, and a woman gave me her coat. And another woman drove us somewhere safe, and we have been safe ever since. And every year, on this day, we come back here. Because this is the booth where everything got better." Auden considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old who had been raised by a mother who told him the truth. "Are they here now? The man and the women?" "No, sweetheart. The man passed away last year. The women are still here, but they are at work." "Okay." He pushed the train across the table again. Across the diner, near the window, a man Marisol had never seen before was paying his check. He was in his late 60s, with neat gray hair and a charcoal coat she had seen once before, on another man, on another morning. He had not looked at Marisol once during the meal. He set down a folded $20 bill and a small white envelope, said something quietly to Junie, and walked out without turning his head. Junie crossed the diner and slid into the booth beside Auden. She set the white envelope on the table in front of Marisol. "He said to give this to you," she said. "He said you'd know what it was. He said he'd been carrying it for a year, and he thought today was the right day." "Who was he?" "He didn't say. He said you didn't know him. He said he was a friend of someone you used to know." Marisol looked at the envelope. It had her name on it. It had been written in handwriting she did not, for a long second, recognize. And then, with a slow drop of her stomach, did. She had not seen that handwriting in 5 years. She did not open it at the table. She took it with her when she left. She walked Auden to the car, with his hand in hers and the train clutched in the other. She drove him home. She fed him dinner. She read him a book about a small bear who was looking for his mother in a forest. She kissed his forehead and turned out the light and stood in the doorway of his room for a long time, watching the slow rise and fall of his small back beneath the blanket, the way she had stood in the doorway of every room he had ever slept in. Then she went into her own kitchen. She poured herself a glass of water. She sat at the table. She opened the envelope. Inside, there was no letter. There was only a single photograph. Old. Cracked at one corner. A black and white image of a woman in her 30s standing on the porch of a small house, in a dress with a high collar buttoned all the way to her jaw. The woman was looking directly at the camera. She was not smiling. But her eyes were the eyes of a person who had decided, against every available piece of evidence, that the world was a beautiful place worth surviving. On the back, in the same handwriting, was a single line. "This was my mother. She would have liked very much to know that you got out. TB." Marisol set the photograph down on the kitchen table. She folded her hands over it. She closed her eyes. A man named Thessaly Brock, who had died of a quiet, ordinary heart attack on a bench outside the Brindlemark Public Library on a Tuesday afternoon in May of the previous year, was, though Marisol did not yet know this, and would not learn it for another 2 weeks, buried in a small cemetery beside his mother, beneath a stone that bore only his name, his dates, and the single line he had asked his executor to engrave for him. He was at the end of someone's block. In the kitchen, Marisol Quentin opened her eyes. She picked up the photograph. She walked it across the room. She placed it on the small shelf above the piano, beside a framed drawing her son had made the previous spring of the 3 of them, herself, Auden, and a wooden train, standing in front of a building with a tree. She stood there for a long moment. Then she turned off the light. Outside, the September wind moved through the maple in the courtyard. Somewhere down the hall, her son turned over in his sleep and made the small sound he had been making since he was 3 weeks and 2 days old. The deadbolt on the front door rested in its locked position, faithfully, the way it had every night for 5 years, holding the door shut against a world that had once been too dangerous to live in. But not anymore. Not for them. Not today.